All right, Summer Storm. I had to quit. I found the game too cumbersome to play, to be honest. And it's a pity because there are interesting things in play here. But when I think back on it, the thing I wanted most from this game, it was a complete disappointment. And that was that it's designed to be an operational framework within which the Battle of Gettysburg can be fought. At least that's what I approached it as. The reality of the matter is, there's a fairly, I think, solidly accurate, maybe the most accurate tactical game contained within this. It's the only game Rick Barber designed, as far as I know. However, the cost of that accuracy is very high in terms of mechanisms that are cumbersome, things that are alike but don't work the same way in many, many different cases. The actual representation in terms of the components that are used to represent everything on the board, the level of painful activity that the players have to perform in order to get that accuracy, and whatever it is. And I don't think it's all that much higher. And I think it's superseded by the amount of mistakes that the cumbersome system and the difficult rules and whatnot bring to play. Now, it's possible, maybe on an electronic version of it or something, that one could play without breaking rules, without making errors. Of course, their strategic planning and everything would still be heavily impacted by their understanding of what was going to happen, even if it didn't actually happen that way. So, whatever. I also found my own personal reluctance to conduct attacks in the game because they necessitated so much annoying effort that I'm not sure I got a realistic picture of what would happen under the circumstances. But yeah, the biggest thing of all is that this attempt to frame the Battle of Gettysburg within a much more, a much broader scope, giving you the operational flavor of the campaign, it's just not really there. If you want to fight a battle on a map, you got to fight it on the Gettysburg map. You don't have options to go anywhere else. The Gettysburg map more or less dictates where the fight's going to be. You know, sure, there is some possibility that maybe some other pieces of terrain on it would be there, but any kind of reasonable view of, hey, if I'm going to be concentrating my army in that area, there's certain roads you want to control on the Gettysburg map, period, the end. If you don't have control of them, you need control of something else on the operational map, right? At least conceptually. Now, unfortunately, the game doesn't take any of that into consideration. It sets the victory conditions to destroying the enemy army, basically, and it doesn't give you any terrain victory conditions that are fixed, which I think is a fair argument and would be a perfectly good argument if you could fight somewhere other than Gettysburg, right? Like if you could reasonably conduct battles to control, even on the operational map alone, to control other roads or something. But there's no concept of trying to maintain a line of supply back, you know, for Lee especially, back to the south, which he absolutely was needing to do. And in fact, the trigger in my scenario of why Lee ends up concentrating his forces at Gettysburg is that's the closest road to that all my forces could coordinate on going back. Nothing to do with any of the victory conditions of the game. If I was following the victory conditions of the game, I probably would have ignored the Gettysburg map entirely and just sat on the operational map and collected another, 3 days worth of plundering victory points, which would have made it impossible for the Union to win the game, to do anything other than lose the game, even if they destroyed the Confederate army, because the operational game is fundamentally broken. and some of the fudges to make sure that, hey, the forces were present in the area on June 30th and could have conceivably fought a battle on June 30th, but each side has its disincentive for bringing its forces together for that. I think if you played just the Gettysburg scenario, things would be okay, although once again, there's no real mandate for the Confederates to launch an attack. They could actually just park, and although they wouldn't be guaranteed victory, if the Union did nothing, they would at least get a draw out of it, which is better than historical. So if you kind of argue, well, what's the historical, did I beat the historical outcome? Yeah, we didn't fight. I didn't lose Gettysburg because we didn't fight. Because there's nothing, even in the tactical game, which forces the Confederates to launch an attack. And that's disturbing, to say the least, because the advantage is certainly on the defender, especially in the good terrain. Let's talk a little bit about components, then I'll dig a little bit more into the rules and why they bother me so much. Well, it's not so much that they bother me so much, it's that I found them unplayable. I really did. Or right at the limit of playability. And with such a big game at that limit, at my limit for playability, it was really a miserable experience to work my way through. A much smaller game might have worked okay, and there are scenarios that are smaller. First of all, there's a huge set of maps, basically 4 maps, but they cover a lot of territory. And these are, Rick Barber designs. I don't particularly find his maps all that attractive. For this game, I found them beyond unattractive, not terribly unattractive. They're okay. But, they're certainly better than the CWB hideous ones. I'm looking for a donut, though. Okay, so here's a donut, in the middle of the board. Just because the way the ridges and whatnot are drawn, and conforming to the hex system, overlay, you get some really ridiculous and ludicrous looking terrain out of it. That bothers me a lot less when I'm looking at something as garish as the CWB map, and it doesn't look as ugly on things like the terrible Swift Sword map. That's one side of it. Another was that it was largely, it was very difficult to discern what's what on the map. Some of that may be the color choices, some may be my eyes, some may be the hand-drawn type nature of it, that it was often difficult for me to discern between one type of slope or one type of, not slope. I can't remember the right word for it. It doesn't really matter. and yeah, you got a whole shit ton of charts. Yeah, they're actually called slopes. So there's slopes and slope hexes. There's rivers that run along the hex sides, or water creeks and whatnot that run along the hex sides, which impact the game, and then ones that are just there for artistic purpose, but can impact the game. They can turn into marshes. The different roads, I found difficult to tell between secondary and tertiary roads, whatever those are, on the map. I found it difficult to determine which elevation level I was at times, because of the colorations and whatnot. Quite often, the hexes, they're normal size and the counters are normal size, but there's enough of a crowding and the map is so busy that at times I found myself unable to discern, whether I'm in a woods hex or not. And there's such a density of counters. You're allowed to stack up to 3 counters in a hex for the most part, but they can each have a couple of informational counters on them. So now you're looking at like 9 counters in a hex, plus maybe, maybe a breastworks or something like that as well. But anyway, getting above 6 counters in a hex is pretty damn common. Like where you see the fighting happening, there were large stacks of counters. And the map is your Clash of Arms standard quality, which is this wonderfully textured paper, nice and thick and heavy, just so beautiful. You would never want to put plexiglass on it if you're me. Unfortunately, such thick, heavy paper invariably pooches too hard, and you need to put plexiglass on top of it, which I did not, and it made my life much, much worse. That, along with the fact that I clipped the counters, they're glossy counters, and they end up slipping more easily than unclipped and or matte counters would. For whatever reason, the glossy paper that they put on the counters, it just ends up making it just a little easier for them to slip. Clipping the counters takes away some deformities that help hold them into position. Just the combination of it all. That was one feature that, caused some of my problems. The map itself was another major feature on its own, just because of the visibility and the difficulty of discerning what was what. And it does not help that the map is in color and the map key is not. This is the map key. And also that some of the aspects of the map, and this is why it was hard to discern in some cases, some of the aspects look like they're kind of in between 2 things. And if you see the 2 things next to each other, it might be possible to determine which one is which, but it's not always terribly easy. An attempt at some form of artwork over usability and a form of artwork that was inconsistent, like how densely indicated a given slope is, for example. It changes. Like there are different places where it's just not clear, what kind of slope you're facing. The cliffs are usually pretty obvious. Then on top of the tactical maps, each player has their own, for a double blind game, operational map. Now the operational map is funky. First of all, the hexes are too small for the counters. That's the first fun. It's the same hand-drawn stuff. It's not as troublesome, except that the hex numbers are hand-drawn, which means that they were often unreadable. like I would look at them and I would see, you know, a 4 instead of a 9 or something like that. And that's important because you have to be able to translate what the hex number is there into the megahexes over here, which are also handwritten, even though apparently the normal technology for numbering hexes was, automatically was used elsewhere in the game or on the map. But also, those operational maps are distortions. They show the road connections between locations, but you can't move overland on them, and you can't really fight on them. I mean, you can, but it's really a huge abstraction of the whole thing. The interlinkage between the operational map and the tactical map is also problematic. In some cases, so first of all, the size of units was not represented on the operational map. So every division took up, cavalry is the opposite, but every infantry division would take up 3 hexes. And some were bigger than 3 hexes on the tactical map, and some were smaller. Another thing is, no matter what formation you were on in the operational map, and there are multiple different formations, but the key ones here are whether you're in a road movement formation or a battle formation. And you might also be in an encamped formation, which is something completely different. And doesn't translate at all, and I don't think you can actually be in that on the operational map, essentially. I mean, I guess you could by just avoiding deploying. But when you're deployed to battle formation and you show up on the tactical map, you deploy as a long column of single units, one per hex along the road, just like as if you were in road formation, which just doesn't make much sense. The game uses a double blind system, but once certain triggers have been accomplished, basically whenever you move a piece, you have to call out the hex you moved it in. So the opponent kind of knows where all your forces are. There's some screening capabilities and whatnot. So they might not know the back side, the more distant forces that you have. And as you call out locations, you might discover the enemy there. So very little operational surprise is achieved in the game once the triggers are fired. The counters themselves, I found them a mishmash of colors. Sometimes Confederate units have the same color as Union units, at least for leaders. You have the color schemes are by corps with a band of color that indicates the given division, I think. I'm not sure. No, I'm lost. Yeah, there's a band of color that I think indicates the division. But you also have artillery units that are at the corps level and require a great deal of mechanical fiddling with them. Every time they fire, they flip over. At the end of every turn, they unflip. That sounds pretty common, but it's their visual representation is not that different from the infantry units. They just don't look. They're not all that clear to me, at least. when scanning through things. But also, they can be buried in a stack. They can be all anywhere in it, really. There could be up to 2 artillery units in a stack, which means that you can't just count on, just keep the artillery on top or anything like that. But also, because it's visibly similar to the infantry, but has a different color band definition, it ends up, if you put the artillery on top where it's easier to see if you need to flip or unflip it, it covers up the infantry designation. Beyond the infantry divisional designation, you have to pay attention to the brigade designation. Now, this is a brigade level game. Each unit in the game is supposed to be a brigade. Yeah, it's not. Each unit, each counter is basically part of a brigade. Not by regiment, just a part. And the concept behind this, or how this is to be dealt with in the game, is you have to kind of keep your brigade together. And it only really functions well when it's all together. Only units of the same brigade can stack together, except under certain exceptions, because there are lots of exceptions. But anyhow, what you end up doing is the artillery ends up covering a unit. You're not sure who it is. You'd have to look up the color coordination for seeing what division it is, the little color band on it. You'd have to actually read the name in the color band, which I found difficult with these glasses, and possibly okay with decent ones and decent lighting. But still difficult. Harder than I would like it to be. As compared to some other, other games where I find it, the things I need to keep track of and deal with, I'm able to do pretty easily in CWB. TSS, I don't know, maybe. Those are awfully tiny writing on them. For the informational counters, combat losses are handled with these little guys. Now, I'm never really thrilled with the use the same number counter and rotate it. It's too prone to accidents. With the amount of popping of counters due to the Poochie map, the spillage and whatnot, I'm sure that I got extra or lesser hits all the time. Beyond that, once you take a hit, you will always be marked with at least one hit, however that is. And so that increases the counter density, across the board. You can never recover that last hit, which is a fair, again, realism factor. But it's an annoying play factor, and there are just tons of these across the board. I would almost rather there be a counter for you haven't lost that first hit, because once you do, you've taken something that you'll never be able to recover, and so it's hard to tell when you're doing recovery which units need to recover, which don't, because you can't simply glance to see do they have a marker under them. No, you have to glance and see what number's on the marker, which requires another step in terms of picking through the counters. I was okay with the shaken and broken counters, but the entrenchment counters were horrible representations. First of all, they're brown on both sides, not exactly the same color, but brown, and they have an image on them that looks similar on both sides. One of them is a bunch of guys digging, one of them I think is a bunch of guys just, I don't know what the hell they're doing. I can't even discern it. But it looks like they might as well be digging, It's just like a blob of stuff, black, humanoids perhaps, in a mass. Some color on them, something to make them stand out that you've actually got you know, what I prefer is something like is in TSS, where there's, you know, what looks like a defensive structure on one side, and the other side a very clean pick and shovel, and just not try to make this messy thing. And the funniest thing about this is Barber's a graphic designer, essentially, but he's managed to make something that in so many ways is difficult to use because the graphics get in the way. And it's not like they're particularly beautiful. I mean, look, some people think his maps are, and I'll let you, you know, you can have that opinion, that's fine. But anyway. All right. The game also came with, my copy at least, The Devil's to Pay, which is sort of an expansion to it or something. Well, instead of doing something to make the operational game, maybe expand the map that you could actually play the battles out on Gettysburg, maybe give you something more to deal with there. Instead, what is a standalone what-if scenario of what if Lee's army was up somewhere where it wasn't historically, and Meade goes and catches him there. And just a completely different battle map, a different kind of operational map. You can't use this operational map to use that, so you can't integrate the two games. Even to say, this would be an interesting place that a battle might have occurred. There's nothing that like drives you to do that. It's just its own little game using the same basic system, which to me is horrible. Okay. You also have to track casualties, not casualties, fatigue points, essentially. Divisional morale is what it's called on here, along with army morale. And you also track points that you have. Now, the divisional and army morale are both things that go up and down throughout the game. So you're marking and erasing stuff. Is it worse than stragglers in, say, CWB or the fatigue points in TSS? A little bit. Because, so stragglers come off casualties in CWB, and they're just constantly happening. So you've always got that in front of you. With this, it's like, if a counter flips over, you lose some divisional morale. Or if it's destroyed, you lose divisional and army morale. Whenever you're pushed out of good terrain, and this is like on a per hex basis, you lose some army morale. You actually gain it, but I'm going to call it losing for the sake of that. And so you've got this chart that's like, it's hard to remember when a unit's shaken or not, and it's kind of hard to remember what things shaken affects. So like, you really have to go down all the list of modifiers on all the tables. And there are a lot of tables. We'll get to, I don't even know if I want to go through the rules and deal with that. I think we're just going to go through my feelings here. So you've got basically 6 pages printed. Each player has a copy of them. Again, wonderful stock. This is the thing Clash of Arms does best, is they print on some good paper. They use real paper for the rules as well, which is really nice. But there's just tons and tons of charts. And the base combat system, for example, operates off of, Berg used to call it the reductio ad absurdum system. I don't know if it really, I don't know why he called it that. But you figure out an odds ratio, and that becomes the first modifier. And then you add a bunch of other modifiers. Now that could be okay if there aren't a lot of modifiers. This is the list of modifiers in combat. And they don't all take place at the same time. Sometimes they affect both players' die rolls, Sometimes they affect one player's die roll. It's kind of a clever system overall. I like it, and eventually you do get used to at least the common modifiers. You might forget some of them. And what happens is both sides roll a couple of dice, and every unit involved in the combat, directly involved in the combat, takes cohesion hits based on the die roll that the enemy had. And the modifiers, a large portion of them are reflective, by which I mean, so for example, if the attacker has a +3, the defender has a -3, which means the defender is unlikely to do hits on you. But then there's a series of modifiers that are not, that are, on a per side basis only, which can kind of neutralize things. And then some that are not reflective but affect both sides, like the weather, which makes sense, but both sides will take their cohesion hits, which might destroy units or whatever, but for the most part it just increments these counters. Once you get up to a 5th hit, instead of marking that with a number, you take the number counter away, you flip the counter over, and then it has another 5 hits before it's destroyed. But then you compare the losses on a per unit basis, not the total losses, that each side took. The side that took the most per unit losses is the loser. Now the winner could have taken a lot more losses total, but basically the weight of their attack is so heavy that they were able to win even though they took more casualties. The loser then has to make a morale check on a per unit basis again, which could require you to make, if you're defending, depends on how many hexes you are really, but it could be 3 rolls per hex very easily. And the attacker, if he manages to lose, the defender's probably in no more than 2 hexes, and it's usually just 1. The attacker might be in quite a few hexes, like 4. So you might be looking at like 8 to 12 die rolls for that. And also you have a lot of options based on what you do. If you're the loser, you're allowed to withdraw before you make your morale check. And that slightly modifies your chances. And then, there's another whole series of modifiers for the morale checks, including things like, I don't remember actually, running back. Yeah, you got to run back and check your sheet to see, hey, is this a shaken or broken division? This is one of the places where you get to look at that. I think you also have to look at it as modifiers for combat. You also might have a leader loss check occur there if they're involved in combat. Let's take a look at the sequence of play. I'll work off that instead of the rolls. All right. So one thing that I didn't get into, and this is one of the bigger things in the game. I'm going to swap batteries first. So something terrible happened, and in the midst of my review, something weird happened with the camera. And I lost part of it. Of course, not scripted, but I'm lucky enough to kind of have a framing here. I may end up going over some of the same stuff, but I'll try. I'm trying to keep into mind what the framing was. So, one of the biggest things in the game is this command chart here. And basically, you're able to spend your commands at the core level. And I think I went into how you get army commands and core command points already before I got to this, but I'm not sure. But essentially each of these has its own little mechanism. Each of these little yellow boxes here has its own little mechanism of how you operate. On the cheapest level of all, you don't spend any command points, and you throw a single chit into the cup. And then it works kind of like a normal chit pull game. Well, maybe not exactly. In a normal chit pull game, both players' pieces go in the cup, and you draw one, and you find out what happens. In this one, both players roll for an activation initiative, whatever. If you have the initiative, you get a bonus on that. Well, you win ties. You also get the first activation of the turn for free, which is extra bonus. And I probably already said that, but I don't know. The next option is you can spend a command point to put a chit into the direct command. And that allows you to control when the activation happens. You still have to win the initiative to activate one of your units. Well, you can force the opponent to activate one of his, but it also gives you some bonuses on die rolls and whatnot. Another thing that you can do is you can spend, I believe it's 2 command points to get an additional chit. And now that additional chit just goes in the cup unless you spend something else for it. Doing that costs you some fatigue points or divisional morale. But the way the defend box, so the way this works, you can just pull a chit out of it and you use that command. The defend box, you put a chit in it, costs you 2 the first turn you put it in, but then maintaining it in there only costs 1 per turn to stay in a defend order. And you put a chit in the cup. You can't use the chit from here. You activate when the chit in the cup is drawn. Okay. The attack order works kind of like the direct order. It costs you 2 each time you do it, and it's going to cost you fatigue as well. Gives you big bonus in attack. Allows you to enter zones of control. Both direct and attack allow you to do that. Reserve allows you to as well. Everything else, kind of, you have conditional cases where you can interject your forces if they're already in contact with the enemy. Okay. The build order works in another different way. The way it works is, I believe you pay 1 to put the counter in here, and then you can move half, and you can leave it in there for free, moving half, or you can pay 2, I don't fucking remember. Like, I just did this, and I knew when I was telling you, but before on the video, but now I just fucking don't. And this is the problem with the whole system, is it's got all these different, like, little command pieces to it, right? R&R, you spend 1 to put it in. So build, I think it's 1 to put it in, 2 to switch it to actually digging. And then you get to stay in there for free. And it costs you 1 to leave build. And R&R works similar to that. It costs you 1 to go in there. The second turn, it costs 2, or maybe it's 2 the first turn and 1 the second, or whatever. I don't fucking remember. Reserve, I think, costs you 1, might cost you 2. So both of these, you put a chit in the cup as to when you get activated. This one, you put 2 chits here, and then when you choose to activate, you withdraw 1 or both chits, depending on what the meaning is. If you withdraw 1 chit, you're actually, you're staying in reserve, but moving half. If you withdraw both chits, you activate the reserve and throw it against the enemy. If you withdraw neither and just leave it there and it can't be burned, you end up, yeah, I really got disconcerted by having to deal with searching all over the camera for this video, and it's not in there anywhere. If you If you leave both in there, then you haven't used your reserve, and it need not be anywhere special. And we already hit this in the next video. I know that already. I was at the reserve, and you end up getting Army morale back for some reason, which is just weird. Anyway, the point behind all of that is that all of these different commands that are there are just this mishmash of different ways of doing things, where not only are the effects of the command different, which is what you kind of expect, you know, but much more different from the effects of the command is how they're manipulated on that little chart in terms of how command points are spent and what you can do with them and everything. And it's such a fucking annoying, like, you know, it's as though they couldn't come up with a smooth system, which may well be the case. But you never want to burden somebody with that many different kinds of ways of doing things. It's fucking annoying. Compare it to like another chit pull system, the blind swords system, where you get to put some extra chits in. There's maybe some event chits and stuff like that. This is an attempt to be much, much more comprehensive and covering certain aspects of command, but strangely not the ones that are covered in CWB. Like, you know, you're basically the Army commander is giving you points to do something, but not really giving you orders as to what you're supposed to do. It's very counterintuitive and hard to grasp what you're actually doing. And you're like, the chain of command and the way the points drive down it doesn't make sense. It's like, why is the overall commander even involved in this? You know, just give me my core command points. That's fine. It feels like it's adding all kind of layers to the game that are, you know, you give me orders to defend something. Do you really have to order me to dig in? Maybe, maybe not. Would that be more expensive or something? That could be added to CWB very easily without making it much more cumbersome. But with this, it's just like, because each little box is so different. Anyway, I'm hoping this fills the gap between the two videos. I don't know what the hell happened with my camera. And my camera just did something really weird. It beeped and said it needs to save battery, and there's plenty of battery, so I don't know what it's up to. I've never had to do that before. It was like, power will shut off to conserve battery. It's like it's a full fucking battery. Normally it doesn't warn me, it just shuts off. It's coming up with a mind of its own. Anyway, where was it? Yeah. So the R&R allows you to get divisional morale factors back, which kind of makes sense because you take DMF from units being flipped over, you take it from fatigue and whatnot, so resting makes perfect sense. The other thing, reserve though, if you leave your units in reserve and don't use them as reserves, but just, and they can be anywhere on the map, like they don't have to be anywhere near the enemy or anything, you end up getting Army morale factors back. It's the only way you get them back. It doesn't allow you to recover your troops or anything. It doesn't allow your divisions to recover. I feel like this is some sort of weird compromise to say, look, the Army should be able to rest in some fashion or another. If you actually are using reserve for the actual reserve order, well, you don't get points back because the chits end up leaving there. But if you end up not using the reserve units, you are doing something that kind of rests the Army, but it's not really resting the individual divisions or their units. I don't really know. This is one of the fuzzier things that I have no idea what he's doing. Then there's one final one of these, which is March mode, which the chit just goes in here. You don't get to use it at all during the normal operations, during the standard movement actions. There's an operational movement segment that comes afterwards where everything gets to go. Each player basically rolls a die at the beginning of each activation. The high roller gets to choose whether they want to do something or the opponent wants to do something. But they got to go through this whole weird mechanism and know what all of these different things do and remember what all the ones that they've chosen, how each one works. I found myself constantly consulting the rules to figure out what I'm doing with some of the odder stuff. In addition, movement is not deterministic in this. You roll a couple of dice when you activate a division, and you see how many movement points they get. But if you spend too many, you get fatigued. You also have the opportunity to use commands to buy additional chits that either just go in the cup, or you can pay more command points to put them somewhere else. When you buy additional chits, you pay fatigue for them. That's kind of the meat of the game. At the end of the turn, there's a recover cohesion segment. That's basically, if you're in R&R, you get that back. There's other things that might happen there. Adjust morale. Okay. You might have gotten shaken or broken markers on your units. You're once again given an opportunity to retreat, and every unit again, except for every unit that's anywhere near contact with the enemy at the beginning of this phase has to roll dice to see if they succeed. And they could lose more cohesion. They could straggle worse and whatnot. Makes sense, but again, it's just all this huge amount of cumbersome effort to try to achieve what is, admittedly, a pretty realistic system, I think. I think one that may, if played perfectly well, and completely understood by the players so they don't make blunders based on, misapprehensions of what's going on. And if they don't bump counters or anything like that, it may be the most realistic tactical system I've seen out there. It's got a nice amount of variability in it. The combat results are very variable. It's hard to get your head around what's a good attack and what's not. I still don't feel like I have, a really great feel for when it's worth attacking, when it's not. You really want to be in the attack command, though, in order to make an attack, just because of the modifiers that generates. But it also does more damage to you. It's more a more intense combat. Commands commands at the core level can be held continuously. They can't be held at the army level, though. And some of them can be spent, I believe, during... Yeah. So there's a slight amount of points that you can spend to move army or corps commanders using those points. But for the most part, if you don't spend them on actual corps commands, you can bank them for future turns on that corps. Send points that they'll get. That'll just be some potential for additional points that they get later on. Or you can spend them on initiative. The advantage of initiative is it gives you the first activation, gives you some bonuses on that first activation. So if you draw from a cup, you're allowed to attack into a zone of control and stuff like that. It also gives a +1 to the activity roll, I think. But also, whoever has the initiative will win all ties on future activation initiatives, individual activation initiatives. And then there's optional rules for the weather and whatnot. There's a fair amount of optional rules in it. Some of these are, add other features to the game, weather, supply wagons, stuff like that. And yes, I, of course, tried to play with everything. I never got around to the mass bombardment, which is the one that they say, this one you really don't want to do unless you know what you're doing. But it kind of has no effect on play if you don't use it. So it doesn't really hurt anybody to throw it in. So I kind of said, well, I'll play with that. But I ended up finding myself again and again not wanting to do things in the game. Like not wanting to launch an attack, not wanting to fire my artillery. Simply because of the cumbersome nature of the game. And what's kind of amusing about it all is that in Barber's designer's notes, at one point or another, he's talking about how he chose his command system because he wanted something more streamlined. He had worked on some of the CWB games as an artist or whatever. He wanted something more streamlined than the CWB command system. And I'm just like, this thing is not more streamlined. I'm having to roll for every single leader, every single turn. The CWB system, I maybe write an order, I don't know, when I'm attacking, quite often I write very few attack orders at all. Sometimes they're kind of detailed, but then it's kind of like point and shoot and just let it go on its way, And I might have to keep checking that leader for a few turns, but eventually he just keeps going, and then I have to start checking to see if he fails. But it's all pretty simple and it's all pretty standard. Here, I've got all these different little mechanisms that each work in significantly different ways and are recorded in different ways, and it's just so painful. It is so painful. And none of it addresses the concept of the overall commander telling, his subordinate, look, I want you to do this, and then seeing that maybe not work well. Instead, the player still has a God's eye view and complete control over what the subordinates are doing. It's just a matter of how much they're able to do. That's what the commander gives them. The overall commander gives them the right to do more stuff. And the core commander also gives them the right to do certain stuff, right? But how they actually manipulate within it and everything and what their goals are, none of that's being expressed in the same way. So I find the order system not as exciting. I think there's interesting concepts within it. That idea of throwing it into reserve or whatever, it does something in the game, but I far prefer the CWB system. But this is in no way more streamlined. That just follows a general rule, and it's fairly simple. You're always looking at the same chart and rolling on the same thing, and it's just really, I find much more streamlined than this. So I found that kind of amusing. Also, the fact that nothing in this game is streamlined. There was something else I wanted to complain about. I don't remember what it was. Oh yeah, I was finding the fatigue rolls were getting in the way of being able to do activity in a way that felt more realistic than any other game that I've played of the era, covering the Civil War tactical stuff. Terrible Swift Sword had a real problem, which is that it just evaluated the units and the firepower and kind of came up with the right casualties per 20 minutes. but didn't put any limitations really on how hard you could fight. They attempted with the fatigue rules. They're not very, very effective at doing that. CWB put its orders in place. And the fact that damaged units really can't continue attacking for very long. A damaged core or whatever will just like stop moving. They'll just say, "No, I'm done. I don't want to do anymore." That limited. So Terrible Swift Sword, I got like double the casualties you should expect. CWB, I was getting too many casualties too. Not as bad as TSS, but too many. Here, a game that doesn't actually track the actual casualty numbers at all, unlike those two systems. I did feel like the units were wearing down quickly. They were taking a lot of casualties in terms of cohesion hits, but I don't know what that means. But I did feel like the battle was not as intensive as it would be in either of the other two systems. In fact, maybe to a point to which it went too far in the other direction, where the units were not fighting enough, where it would be very hard to accomplish, say, I mean, it should be hard, but to accomplish, say, what the Confederates did in the second day attack or whatever. But whatever interesting facets there are to the game, whatever realism there are, it's just the price in terms of the mechanical complexity is just so high that I can't recommend this at all. Especially since the one thing that I saw this game is doing, it fails at utterly. It absolutely fails to give you an operational goal and victory situation. It fails to address critical concerns that Lee would have about his army and why he would head south with it again and march into Gettysburg. It just sort of assumes that you're trying to destroy the enemy, which probably is not the case. Yes, Lee would have loved to, he was perfectly willing to eventually, once he saw that there was an engagement underway, he was perfectly willing to engage fully and to try to fight to a victory at Gettysburg. And certainly Meade was willing to fight a defensive battle. But there really is no feeling of what you would do if the enemy weren't there, and how the enemy is forcing you to come to battle. And then beyond that, there are little problems. So I harp a lot about the fact that the Confederates can bank enough victory points in the operational game to win the game without doing anything, whereas they don't get any of those points if they play the historical scenario. But if they make their arrivals happen at the time of the historical scenario, they would have more than enough points to just win the operational game. I think that there are little fixes you can make to that. But there's much, much bigger fixes that need to be taken into account, such as the Confederates need to control a road back to their own territory. If they do not have a supply route back to their own territory, or a retreat route, or whatever, they've got a real problem. It's not at all handled in the game. For the Gettysburg scenario alone, what would do that? Well, giving Cemetery Hill some victory points, like most games do. Or control of the road being important, but it's not. Now, on the operational map, there are a lot of other options, right? So all the roads kind of go through Gettysburg that are heading south here. But there's a major road going here through Greencastle, down through Hagerstown, and then another one over here going through Hanover and heading down. Well, what would have made a really interesting game? Extending the map on both sides the tactical map, allowing the battle to be fought around any of those roads, any of those towns, that would have made sense. If you're gonna fight at the Gettysburg map, they're really terrain is actually determinant, or should be. And the fact that this game just says, "Oh yeah, you're just there to destroy the enemy," that's just bullshit. It's just bullshit. You know, there are key factors that needed to be addressed that were not. Could those be addressed? Yeah, I guess. But and you could steal something from the line of battle, last chance for victory or whatever. You could steal something from that for the tactical game alone. For the operational game, it just doesn't make sense because you don't have the operational flexibility to choose which path you're gonna operate, you're gonna use as your axis of advance. Anyway. I found this so disappointing in so many ways. It shows glimmers of something good, but like I said, when I read that somebody said, this is probably the best of tactical system I've seen for the American Civil War or whatever, I would have to argue it's probably the worst. Simply because the mechanical burden is so high on it, that it's right on the edge of playability. You know, I got through quite a bit of it in my mind, but you know, I still only got through half of the first day of Gettysburg. Yeah, I got through all of June 30th, but a lot less was happening then. And just had to give up. I mean, I just could not cope with what this game was demanding of me. So yeah, it's a pity.